Okay, so IAM is nothing but Identity and Access Management. So IAM is where you can create users, add users, modify the users, and create groups, roles, principles. So all kind of activities, access, everything will be managed by the IAM. Okay, so IAM playing the major role in AWS because that is where you can get all kinds of access, privileges, all those things. Some users need access to console and some users need CLI, some users need both AWS CLI as well as console. All kinds of privileges, access has been given by IAM itself. So in this module we are going to see IAM users, groups, role, federated identity management, Amazon Cognito, what is AWS organizations, all those things. First we'll see account users and IAM. When you first create an AWS account, you will be beginning with the root users. The root users means the one which you have used to sign up your AWS account. That is the root users. That user will have the full privileges. That means that user will have the complete access to all the AWS services and resources within your account. This identity is called as AWS account root user. Okay. So within that root users, you can view all the information like billing information, personal data, your entire architecture and components. Since the root user have the extreme power with all their privileges, you cannot use root users to create your architecture or infrastructure. You cannot use them, means it is not recommended to use it, because if it is, anything can happen without your knowledge. If mistakenly if you deleted, if you have added something, so it will be create a problem. So AWS always recommends not to use root users to all the activities. Better to create some other users that we'll be seeing in the next slide. As I said, AWS root users will have full access to all the resources in the account, and you cannot control the privileges of the root account credentials. So that's the reason AWS strongly recommends that you not use root account credentials for day-to-day interactions with the AWS. IAM users can be managed and audited with the relative ease if on IAM account principle, that will be discussed later, which needs more privileges that can be added later. Likewise, if privileges needs to be removed or revoked, it can be done with a minimal impact on an environment. So that's where we are going to use IAM to create additional users and assign permissions to these users and some privileges. Okay. So safer way to use administrator account is create an admin users, don't use root users, and lock the root user credential, and use the IAM admin users to do all your interactions with the activities. So as you asked, everybody wants root users to be created, but you cannot restrict that access granularly. So what you have to do, it is very important to securely use the account in your AWS profile. So that's the reason we are creating some administrator account and create the additional account for ease of access and security security reasons. Okay. So least privileges you have to give to the any users that you have been creating. While it is possible to create accounts that have the privileges similar to those of AWS account root user, that's what you are asking, it is better to create admin account that control only the functionality needed. Okay, because it will helpful to have various accounts and account types. Permissions can be added and removed as needed. In IAM, you can create users with help of identity and access management, as well as you can assign users individual security credentials such as access key, passwords, multi-factor authentications, etc., etc. Or at the same time, you can request temporary security credential also to the particular users to provide user access to the particular resources and the services in the AWS. Using IAM, you can specify permissions to the control which operation as a user that can be performed. There is a concept called Federated Identity Management. For that, you have to request security credentials with the configurable expiration of the users who managed by the corporate directory. For example, if you are using Active Directory in your account, on your organization to log into your laptop or your any servers, you can use the same username password to AWS also to log into your application, any application or any services by federating with the AWS. So what happens, every time it will go to your Active Directory and check whether the user is active or not, or belong to the particular organization or not, and then it will allow you to log into the AWS console or AWS resources or any applications. By doing so, it will provide a secure access to employees as well as application, so that they can access resources in an AWS account without creating any additional user account for them. You have to specify the permissions for these security credentials to control which operations a user can perform. Having said that, IAM is a service that helps you control access to your AWS resources. IAM allows you to create user accounts and credentials with varying degrees of account permissions and authorization. IAM can be accessed from the console, AWS CLI, AWS SDK, and the secure API endpoint. Okay. Next is IAM principles. What is principle? A principle is an entity that can take on action on an AWS resources. Over the time, you can allow users and services to assume a role. You can support federated users as well as programmatic access to allow an application to access your AWS account. Users, roles, federated users, and applications are all part of AWS principles. The principle can be on AWS IAM user, on AWS services such as EC2, identity provider, SAML provider, etc. etc. On identity provider, what is identity provider? Identity provider can be used instead of creating IAM users in your AWS account. With an identity provider, you manage your user identities outside of AWS. You can use third-party service like Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and it will give the external user identity permissions to use your resources within your account. You would have seen that in previously some 5-6 years back, if you want to log into the any website, you have to sign up. But nowadays, if you see, if you log into the any website, any applications, there will be options you will be getting down. Sign in with your Google account, sign in with your Facebook account, sign in with your Amazon account, sign with your LinkedIn account. It's like that, right? So that's what call it as an identity provider. Same thing we can also use in AWS to log in with your Amazon account or Google account or Facebook account. Okay. First we'll see what is IAM users. IAM users are not separate account. That first we have to understand. They are the principals within your account. Each IAM user can have its own password for access to the console. You can also create an individual access key for each user so that the users can make programmatic requests to work with the resources within your account. It is possible to have access to the console without access to the CLI. The vice versa also. possible. That means it is possible to have access to only CLI without having access to the console. Now I am logging into the AWS console and I am creating all the resources, right? You can do the same thing by logging into the CLI mode also. Some users will be good at CLI. They are not good at CLI. They are not good at a GUI mode, that is user interface mode. So they can create any resources. You can, whatever you are trying to do in console level, you can do the same thing, or you can achieve everything by running in the CLI mode also. So you are the one going to provide the access or permission how the user wants to access the AWS, whether it can be console or it can be a CLI mode. Newly created IAM users have no default credential to use to authenticate themselves and access AWS resources. You, as an admin, you need to assign some security credential to them for authentication and then attach permission that authorize them to perform any AWS action or access any AWS resources. The credentials you create for the users are what they use to uniquely identify themselves to the AWS. Okay. So basically, you are, as admin, you are the one going to decide the user how they have to access, what they have to access, what kind of privileges they have to access. Everything you have to decide. The birth of an IAM users. As I said earlier, whenever you create any new users, there are no default permissions assigned to that IAM users. Again, IAM users is part of Iim Principles. So AWS does not recommend giving everyone admin rights. That's a thumb rule. It's good for you also to manage, because if anybody has changed, so you cannot track it if you give admin rights to everyone. So that's why AWS is asking you to follow some least privileges principle. That means start with a very basic level of access, then step by step, if they ask, you can give and you can analyze what they need. You can provide the access later also. Okay. So far we have seen how to create users, what is the role of users. Now, if the user wants to perform any action, it depends upon the policy that you are assigning to it. How the policy has been assigned. What is policy? Policy is an again entity in AWS that when attached to an identity or resources which is defining the permissions. AWS evaluates those policies that you have created for the principal such as users whenever they make a request. IAM policies only control access to AWS services. Keep it in mind, IAM policy only control access to the AWS services. IAM has no visibility above the hypervisor layer and it cannot reach outside of AWS. If you want OS support, you have to use LDAP, SAML or other identity management system to get a permission. So how the IAM will determine the permissions? Policies gives you the opportunity to fine-tune privileges granted to an IAM users, groups and roles. Because policies are stored in JSON format. They can be used in conjunction with a version control system. It is good idea to define least privilege access to each user or group or role. Then you can customize access to the specific resources using an authorization policy. When determining whether permission is allowed, IAM first checks for an explicit denial policy. See, first it will check the denial policy. If it is denied, yes, it is denied. Then if it is no, then it will be allowed explicitly. Then it will check for the allowed explicitly policy. If then checks for explicit allow policy. If neither explicit deny or explicit allow policy exists, IAM reverts to the default implicit deny. This is how IAM determines the permissions of each user. Okay. Next is granting permissions. So already we have seen IAM users, we have to create a policy and attach that policy to the users. How we can create policy? What is there inside the policy? Permissions in the policies determine whether the request is allowed or denied. Policies are stored in AWS as JSON format that we have seen already. It is attached to the principal as identity-based policies. If the policies are attached to a resources, then it became a resource-based policies. Okay, we'll see one by one what is identity-based policy, what is resource-based policy. First, we are going to see what is identity-based policy. Identity-based policies are permissions policies that you can attach to a principal, such as on IAM user, role, or group. These policies control what action that identity can perform, on which resources, and under what conditions. That is called identity-based policies. Again, in identity-based policy, you can further categorize into two types. One is managed policies, another one is inline policies. Under managed policies, again there are two types. One is AWS managed, another one is customer managed. AWS managed policies means that are managed policies created and managed by AWS. For example, if you are new to the using policies, AWS recommend that you start by using the AWS managed policies. Second, customer managed policies. Customer managed policies are managed policies that you create and manage in your AWS account. Customer managed policies provides more precise control over your policies than AWS managed policies. You can create and edit on IAM policy in the visual editor or by creating the JSON policy document directly. There is a policy generator is available in AWS. Using that, you can create a policy if you are not good at JSON, or if you are good at JSON, you can directly go and write the policy in the JSON format. It's up to you. But all the flexibilities has been given by AWS. But you have to understand what is AWS managed policies, what is customer managed policies, which one will have the precise control of your policies. Third, inline policies. Inline policies are the policies that you create and manage that are embedded directly into a single user or group or role. Okay. This is called identity based policy. Next is resource based policy. Resource based policies are JSON policy document that you attach to a resource, such as on Amazon S3 bucket. These policies control which action a specified principal can perform on that resources and under what conditions. Resource-based policies are always inline policies. In resource-based policies, there is no managed resource-based policies. So like identity-based policies, we don't have customer managed or AWS managed. Resource-based policies are always inline policies. Okay. Having said that, IAM identities are technically AWS resources. You can attach a resource-based policy to one IAM identity. Okay. See, so an IAM user is really just an identity with associated permissions. Definitely, when you create a user, you have to attach some permissions and you have to provide the access, whether that user has to access console or CLI or both. You have to create an IAM user to represent an application that must have credential in order to make request to AWS. An application might have its own identity in your account and its own set of permissions to access AWS services. This is similar to how in modern operating systems or processes have their own identities and permissions. For example, if an application or even an EC2 instance has permission to access something like S3 bucket, there is no need to embed credential in the code. You can just write a policy for EC2, write a policy for RDS, write the policy for S3 and attach to that user. That user can directly go and access the EC2, RDS, S3, whatever it is. Again, that is based on the permission that you defined in the policies. You can define what level of access or permissions that you have given for EC2. Maybe you can given only the EC2 create, not delete, not restart, not reboot, like that. You can give access only to S3, like only upload, don't delete any object. So like this, you have to define that. Okay. Okay, so far we have talked about the JSON and all when we creating policy. So IAM policy is a formal statement of one or more permissions. You can attach a policy to any IAM entity. Policies authorize the action that may or may not be performed by the entity. A single policy can be attached to the multiple entities. A single entity can have multiple policies attached to it. So everything you have to create in the JSON format, it should be like this. You have to define how the permission has been described, what kind of access you have to provide it. Again, this is the another example. In this example, if you see, so they have given user access to access the specific DynamoDB table, and they are allowing to that, and then they are allowing to access specific S3 bucket and its content, and they are explicitly denied to the principals to cannot use any other DynamoDB or S3 resources other than the specified table and bucket. You can define in the first set of permissions. If you see, they have given allow to DynamoDB and S3, but within the DynamoDB and S3 particular table or particular object only you can access. Other than that, you cannot access. Like that, you can give the granular permission to your resources. Always keep in mind, an explicit deny statement takes precedence over an allow statement.